What's up, bangers? Welcome back to the Banger Hangar for the brand new version of your favorite show from BangerTV. This is Horns Redux, not live, but in some comfy chairs, sitting down and discussing, debating, and locking horns around all things metal. Hey everybody, it's Sam Dunn. How are you? I'm coming to you from the Banger Hangar at the BangerTV studio for yet another installment of Horns Redux, where we like to pick apart, dig into, and lock horns over everything heavy metal music and culture. You know the usual housekeeping. Please subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. We're trying to build the ultimate destination for metal news and debate online. This time, we're digging into, I guess, kind of a philosophical, somewhat abstract concept, and that is microgenres and subgenres of heavy metal. We all know that we love to pick apart this music and talk about how to classify the thousands, perhaps even millions, of metal bands around the world. So that's what we're doing this week. Before I introduce my guests, we did a little bit of research leading up to the show, and according to Every Noise at Once, which uses an algorithm to categorize songs, there are currently over 300 metal subgenres and microgenres today. And they just keep getting better in terms of the names. We've got Charred Death, Necro Grind, Cyber Metal, and Depressive, Suicidal, Black Metal, just to name a few. So really we're here to figure out what this all means, and we hope by the end of the discussion we land on what we consider to be the 5 most relevant, significant, meaningful microgenres of metal today. But enough from me. To my left, to your right, Chris Bruni from Profound Lore Records.
Thanks for having me, Sam.
Yeah, man, good to see you.
It's
been
again.
A while.
It's been a minute, yeah.
This guy's been around for a long time doing what he's doing. I'll give you the full introduction in a minute. And you know this guy over here, Blayne Smith. Good to see you as always.
Hanging out.
We see each other every day, so it's
less impactful.
It's not really a big deal. So I want to pull you guys into this. First with you, Chris. You know, we've got genres, we've got subgenres, we've got microgenres of metal. Maybe generally, like, what are they? Why do we have these in metal, do you think?
I think metal, especially today, it's such a I think at its peak diversity.
Yeah.
So many bands playing so many different styles, influenced by so many different styles.
Yeah.
And we have an abundance of metal bands today, like probably more than ever.
Yeah.
Especially these days today.
Yeah.
But I think with a genre like metal and its subgenres, I mean, there's so many different styles within each subgenre of metal.
Yeah.
So I guess it's really narrowing it down to these really specific different sounds and different kind of, again, just the diverse palette a lot of these bands tend to bring forth.
So do you think it's primarily because, simply put, there are just so many more metal bands around today than, say, 10, 20, 30, 40 years ago? Is that the main reason?
I think it's part of the reason.
Yeah.
I think with the rise of technology and whatnot, it's become easier for bands to record, to get stuff out there. It's just become more convenient for a lot of these new bands to do stuff, which makes a lot of kids getting into metal starting bands. You know, they're becoming more inspired. I'm assuming, anyways. So I mean, it's just, again, I think it's one of the most, probably if not the most diverse music genre today in all of music.
Yeah, it's
so
huge.
It's huge.
It's insane. Blayne, why the subgenres and microgenres of metal, do you think?
Well, as Chris was mentioning, it is crazy how diverse metal is. I mean, you wouldn't think it based on how strict we are about what is and isn't metal. Metal, every single metalhead has a definition of, that's not metal. But you're like, okay, well, what is metal? Is it playing fast? And you're like, okay, yeah, it's playing as fast as possible, but it's also playing as slow as physically possible. It's also playing as angrily as possible, but it's also playing as happily as possible with all these different genres. So you have such a large playground to work with that you get a lot of subgenres. But I think the reason a lot of the times we have microgenres is less about communicating to people, hey, you should listen to this, this is what this is about, so much as a bunch of us of fans of a specific thing putting up a warning sign for people, being like, look, I understand you like black metal and death metal. This is a very specific thing. Just because you like those genres, you might not like this microgenre.
It's a signpost.
Yeah.
It gives us all direction in the endless chaos, I guess, of music and the internet and technology. I mean, Chris, a bit of background on you. I mean, you've been running Profound Lore for around 15 years now, and you know, my sense is you've really built your label around bands that really fit into the conversation that we're having today. I mean, Lingua Ignota, Pallbearer, Portal, Bell Witch. So, I mean, as much as you're today sort of reflecting and observing it, you're part of it.
Yeah, because I would say that I've worked with such a diverse roster of artists who play different styles, and even though I work with a lot of bands that play different styles, even within their own genres, everything still fits into the same aesthetic. That's what counts.
Right.
You know, even the non-metal stuff I put out with, it's still relatable to something like Pallbearer, something like Portal, especially Lingua Ignota. Lingua Ignota I don't consider metal at all, but her work is really heavy. It's dark. It's really intense. It's really moving as well.
So you see there's some shared DNA.
There's definitely some shared DNA. She comes from more like death industrial, neoclassical chamber music, and even in the noise scene as well. But that's all relatable into metal, I think, anyways. So I guess, again, just the diversity of artists I've worked with, and some of these artists I've worked with, you know, they've helped pioneer some of these microgenres as well, like post-black metal, and even some band, you know, whether it's, you know, death metal as well too. And even some bands like Pallbearer, for example, they've kind of set a new standard for like traditional doom metal, bringing in different non-metal influences from, you know, 70s prog, you know, bands like Boston and stuff like that to their sound. So
maybe the genres don't exist anymore in the sense. Like, is it
it's
all
almost a blur,
subgenre and microgenre? Like, because I guess what I'm thinking is like, is there anything that's just thrash? Is there anything that's just death metal? Or are we living in a world now where everything needs 1, 2, 3 more qualifiers on top of it?
Well, yeah, because we've kind of like expanded what even death metal is, right? As enough of these genres have been around long enough that we're currently going through an old school death metal revival, which is playing death metal the way death metal is traditionally is now a subgenre of death metal. It's just like,
how did that happen?
You're like, wait, what?
It's just like, we're going around in circles here. I hear you. Yeah, because it's like a call and response, right? It's like you expanded all these different microgenres, and it's like, well, hey, we forgot about where we started, and so you get that whole loop going on. What are do you have favorite microgenres of metal?
Off the top of my head, I'd say Funeral Doom. I really like that. I love releasing bands that fit into that microgenre or subgenre. So I like you know, stuff that's, well, not a specific microgenre, but I like metal that has just a heavy artistic kind of edge and artistic aura to it. I guess.
A little less straightforward, a little less obvious.
Yeah, the bands I like to work with are bands that push the, you know, sonic and aesthetic thresholds to their limits within their specific genres, like a band like Portal and Pissgrave do within death metal, like you know, like Bell Witch and Pallbearer do within doom metal, right? Yeah, it's just trying to find, you know, like bands that kind of just push kind of the artistic aura of their, you know, aesthetic to the limit. You know, that's what essentially I like overall within metal. But I don't want to say, like my favorite genre of metal is art metal. Like that's, I don't know, that may be kind of vague, but you know, just I look at it as an overall aesthetic.
Well, here's a question I want to ask you, given that you're looking at this partly through, obviously, the lens of being a fan, first and foremost, but also running a label.
Yeah.
Is positioning a band or marketing a band as coming from a specific micro genre, is that a good thing? Is that an advantage, or is it working against the artist?
It depends. It depends on the band. That's why I ask them, do you want to, do you want to be, if they have a specific kind of sound, like sometimes they're not comfortable being referred to as post black metal, black gaze, or whatever, right?
Yeah.
So some bands just want to be, categorized as doom metal.
Yeah, we're into this whole debate, right? Like, I've never met a band that likes to be categorized. Yet at the same time, there's so much music. We need signposts.
Yeah,
maybe it's not a bad thing that a band gets sort of classified as war metal or depressive, suicidal, black metal, or whatever. What's your thoughts on that?
I always think that generally when we have the microgenres, all tend to be micro because they're weird, right? They're like, it's not really you get like a microgenre that's like got some great radio play possibility. Otherwise, there would be a bunch more people into it. So I think the microgenres are good because generally the person making a microgenre band, the microgenre band, isn't under the impression that maybe this war metal record will get onto the Billboard charts. Maybe we'll, So for them, it's, it might be slightly isolating to have a genre that a lot of metalheads haven't even heard of, but they know that if they put that on there, there's going to be a couple of weirdos that can just, I think something went up on Bandcamp that's tagged war metal. I need to purchase it immediately before even listening to it.
Yeah. But sometimes what I want to say is that even when metal fans hear a description of a band, of a new band saying they're post black metal, black gaze, or a bunch of those kind of descriptions, sometimes they'll roll their eyes. Oh, another one of these bands that are just so specifically, so I kind of, you want to avoid that as well too, in a way, when you market a band.
Sure.
So I want to, I don't want to just, I'm very careful about how I project, how I describe a band I work with, or
Well, if nothing else, it gives us.
Yeah,
right. Yeah,
nice little sticker on this.
But obviously, we're not the only ones that have an opinion on this, so we want to hear what people have to say who are watching Lock Horns. Danny Terry says, it helps me find other similar artists when I'm searching for music. There's a limit, though. When it gets too specific, then you end up with one or two bands in the microgenre, which is mostly pointless. So there's some kind of line in the sand here, I guess, that's hard to define, but it's a line that's there for people in different places. Dave Follett says, I think genres are a little silly to begin with, but I understand they serve a purpose to give the consumer a rough idea of what something is. Subgenres are a little more silly, but I guess I get it. Now we're talking microgenres, when in reality a ton of those microgenres sound similar to each other. We've done so much to differentiate from the other bands that it all feels like one giant gray smear of nothing now. Maybe that's a genre name. Giant smear of nothing metal. John Simpkins says, when I first got into metal in 1986, I didn't understand the difference. I just listened to metal. I read the reviews and bought the albums. Genre naming always seemed to be the way of differentiating who was heavy, fast, singing, screaming, or growling. There was always an element of elitism towards what was the next big thing or what was considered faster, better, new, improved, which I think just continues to snowball with ever interchangeable terms. And Wyatt Wilcher says, well, yes and no. For something like Suffocation, where I wouldn't necessarily label them as brutal death metal, even though that is what they are, but I would rather label them as simply death metal. We could spend all day discussing subgenres and subgenres of subgenres, but in my opinion, certain metal genres belong to a more broad root subgenre of metal that I would more likely label them as. Lastly, Vince Lepore says, depends. If it's just based on a region, it doesn't make much sense to me. If it is an alternate form of a subgenre with very few bands, such as war metal, funeral doom, pirate metal, it makes sense. Yeah, so clearly a lot of opinions there as to the good and bad of subgenreification, microgenreification. One thing it makes me think of, though, is that maybe all this classification, this sort of bifurcation, you know, getting under the microscope is a good thing. And like part, I think, of what attracts a lot of people to metal is that it is this sort of enigmatic, hidden thing that it requires sort of like a process of discovery and a journey. I mean, is that part of the excitement of metal for you?
I think so, yeah, because you know, a lot metal fans are essentially nerds who like to really dig deep and like to really go down that rabbit hole to discover something. And you know, everyone likes to wear, everyone likes to be the first person to wear the shirt of a new band or a cult band.
Yeah. I mean, is that enigmatic element of metal part of the attraction for you too?
Oh, I think absolutely. I mean, you know, my first Banger TV interaction was me coming on and talking about Death Doom, right?
What about this thing we're calling Death/Doom? Like, how did you get into this style of metal particularly?
Death Doom was kind of just an accident, I guess. I didn't even realize it was Death Doom when I first started listening to it because I like Doom a lot. I like death metal, not as much, but I like death metal as well.
Right.
But the problem with doom metal is how do you get things done when you're listening to doom metal? You know, like you can be sad at home and listen to some doom metal, but sometimes you need to be sad at the bank, and then sad getting groceries, and then you need to be sad making dinner, and you know, maybe sad ball hockey afterwards.
Right.
Adding the death into the doom gives you the ability to actually get some stuff done with it.
That's right. You gotta get the release valve on that
a bit
sadness.
of up tempo.
What are the hallmarks of this style of metal, in your opinion?
Okay, so I think the thing that Death Doom does really well is it takes sort of the best part of both genres and kind of combines them. I mean, it's still very much doom metal sonically. The sounds, the guitar tone, is going to really sound doomy, but then you're going to integrate some death metal rhythmically. Yep. So the vocals, which in death metal are kind of just an instrument instead of someone singing, and the drums are going to sound a lot more like they're from a death band, but at the same time, thematically, and then like an album cover is still probably going to look like a doom metal band.
Yeah.
That's my favorite genre, which I guess maybe is not a microgenre anymore.
Partly because I don't even know what the fuck it is.
I know, right? Maybe it's
Old
kind
guy.
of graduated to a subgenre.
When death metal was death metal. Fucking pestilence. End of conversation. Sorry. Continue.
So for me, yeah, it's definitely there's a thing where there's a satisfaction about getting down and getting to something where there's a very high probability you think that there's going to be a nice sense of community there. There's a good sense of community to something like death metal, but there's still it's a broad genre. There can be people in there that maybe you're like, oh, I want to find a tighter knit thing. Metalheads, we love detail, right?
Yeah.
I mean, how many metal bands are named after Tolkien things? And part of the reason is because we love Tolkien, but part of the reason is because Tolkien named 100,000 things.
You realize you've just come up with another episode of Horns Redux anyway. Tolkien metal.
So
Not
when
to be
people
confused with token metal. It's a different conversation.
When people criticize, when people don't like Tolkien, they're like, I don't want to hear an hour about the inscription on this ring. But when people love Tolkien, they're like, I want to see the letters that were on that ring, and I want to learn that language.
Yeah.
So
we are the people that don't have a lot to say, but once we do, you can't shut us up.
Yeah.
Speaking of which, we should go to some comments about specific microgenres within metal, because I think we want to start now steering towards what are those meaningful microgenres of metal today, so we can get some sense of where this music is going. Funeral doom is a microgenre that's come up, and I guess we want to hear what that is, and I suppose why is it part of the future of metal. Corey Che McGilligot says, I think funeral doom sits right at the cusp of genre/microgenre. It's been floating around for years, and there's a ton of funeral doom bands right now. As far as the best representation, it'd be either Mournful Congregation or early Ahab. Dana Willette on Funeral Doom says it's slow and sad while also being beautiful and introspective. This is more of a definition, I guess. The mood is perfect. I love that the silences and the notes that don't get played are just as important as the notes that do, and that's rare in metal because there's a lot of fucking notes. It's not a genre that will never have mass appeal, but bands like Mournful Congregation, Bell Witch have really expanded what is possible with slow atmospheric metal, and newer bands are even adding a lot of beauty by blending funeral doom with classical influences. Just my 2 cents, says Dana. Julian David Gwillian is saying that Funeral Doom, the riffs are crushing, the vocals are low, and you feel like you're on a walk into hell after you've transcended into non-existence. Not to mention songs can range anywhere from an average of 3 or 5 minutes to over an hour. It's definitely my favorite genre. Blayne, Funeral Doom, thoughts?
Obviously, I love Funeral Doom. I mean, Bell Witch mentioned in there is an album I gave a 5 out of 5 to. I think it's a very
And
great...
for the record, there's no payoff happening here.
It's a great definition of why we have microgenres, I think, because just because someone likes Doom doesn't mean they will like Funeral Doom. It's really Doom taken to the extreme.
Right.
And it's going to isolate some people, but it's going to really connect with certain other people. And I think part of the reason you make it a microgenre is because with something like, say, black and thrash, you can say the words black and thrash and people will go, okay, I understand what that means. And
right.
even if they haven't heard the band, they can kind of guess it. A band like Mournful Congregation or Thurgotten or Bell Witch, when you're describing these bands, you know, how do you do it with the existing tools you have? You're like, well, it's death metal, but it's slower.
Yep.
And you're like, oh, so is it ambient death metal? And you're like, no, it's not very ambient. It can be very heavy and harsh. You know, like a band like Wormphlegm is very slow and there's not a lot going on, but
Yep.
it's definitely not ambient. So you go, okay, well, how would I communicate this to someone?
yeah.
And you're like, okay, well, I think we need to come up with a way to communicate this to someone.
And obviously, with Bell Witch being on the label,
Right.
Funeral Doom is a style that you've connected with as a
Yeah,
fan.
I've been listening to the Funeral Doom since, you know, the mid-90s. You know, with bands like Thurgothon and Skepticism. I mean, those were like the first Funeral Doom bands I got into.
Yep.
And then obviously Mournful Congregation, Evoken, who I also work with.
Yep.
Those are some staples of the Funeral Doom genre as well.
Yep.
This band Worship, their last tape before Doomsday demo is one of my favorite Funeral Doom releases ever.
Yep.
Such a crushing and moving release. So yeah, like there are bands that, you know, with Funeral Doom, I mean, there's obviously, like for me, with bands like Skepticism and Thurgothon, the really early stuff, there's a sense of minimalism as well too.
Right. Yeah.
Whereas like bands like Evoken and Mournful Congregation are a little bit more, I guess, expansive.
Yeah.
Especially like Evoken has definitely expanded their sound.
Right.
Now that's kind of going beyond the Funeral Doom kind of paradigm.
Yeah. This is a sidebar. I mean, when we did the Heavy Metal Family Tree in 2004, which now is beginning to feel like an ancient tablet of metal, given the conversation we're having now, where we literally like claim to put most of the subgenres of metal on one poster-sized sheet of paper, which I realize now is impossible because obviously the internet was around in 2004, but the changes in the last 15 years in terms of social media and the way that music gets consumed, distributed, made, etc., makes that version of the tree impossible. And I maintain it's like the pre-subgenre era of metal, certainly the pre-microgenre of metal is like a while ago, right? And this is where we are, and this is the future of metal. That's my rant. We're going to go to the next microgenre. War metal is next up. John Brassey says, war metal is the meanest music, a sonic sludge of tunneled out feedback doing to blasphemy what grindcore does to politics. I like that. Suffer the guitar scrapes of conqueror, guard your loins for revenge's cruel drum pummeling. Imagine marauding a village in a 100 werewolf pack. War metal captures this rush. This is good. We're the gluttons for punishment, right? Metalheads, that's the other thing. It's a weird thing, but it's real. Vince is back. War metal, an alternate take on black and death metal. While black and death is death metal with influences and aspects of black metal, war metal does the opposite by being black metal with the brutality of death metal. Fuck, I need an abacus to figure this out. Or at least a scale. Just sheer pummeling riffs, blast beats that instill pure adrenaline. Tyler Craig says war metal emphasizes the other, often more neglected side of black and death metal formula. It mixes the brutality of death metal with the sheer wall of sound and ferocious tremolo riffs that are essential to black metal. Lastly, Christopher Beams, war metal, what is it? Immediately the likes of Sabaton and Teresis comes to mind, and they are power metal bands. Reading the descriptions here, it sounds like I have the wrong end of the stick, and it's black and death metal at its most vicious and brutal. Okay, anyway, I'm fucking confused now. I don't know how Sabaton got in there, threw me for a loop, but anyway, what's war metal to you, Chris?
To me, it's just like it's like a more bestial version of, I guess, black metal.
Okay.
Primitive, raw, but still ferocious.
Right.
Obviously, bands influenced by Sarcophago,
Okay, yeah.
probably early Beherit.
Yep.
I think those bands helped set the template for war metal. Blasphemy being our pioneers.
Right.
You know, pretty much my favorite Australian metal band, Bestial Warlust.
Right.
It's the pinnacle of war metal for me. Both their albums,
Right.
Conqueror, Revenge. You know.
War metal?
Yeah, another thing I'm a big fan of. It's great. You know, Canadian pride, right? We're
Is this
kind
just
of,
Blayne's the microgenres I'm a fan of episode?
Well, I think I've seen the rest of the
fucking wrote
script.
this?
We've got some stuff coming up. But yeah, Canadian pride, right? We're kind of the reason it's a thing. Revenge, Blasphemy, Conqueror. You know, it wouldn't be what it is without us. So you know, you got to have some country pride. It's weird that war metal came out of Canada, but
Yeah.
definitely not what you'd expect. But yeah, I mean, again, right? Like everybody was saying. Well, they're trying to define it, and they say, well, technically it's black and death metal, but it doesn't sound like any black and death metal you know.
Right.
I think a really cool thing that war metal does is that it manages to take the early second wave of black metal sound, that like poorly recorded, weird, the wall of sound, the kind of to it, but to do that without it necessarily having to be recorded on some shitty 4-track in your house in the woods. They've found a way to kind of communicate that energy and that feeling and that sentiment without having it just absolutely have to sound like crap.
Right, well, because you all know that Sarcophago sounded the way they did back in the early days is because that's all they had.
That's all
to
they
sound
had.
like that,
Yeah,
and now we
yeah.
get into a process where younger musicians are wanting to replicate that in some way or pay homage to it, but do something new at the same time. We're going to move on. We've got lots to talk about. Black and roll / death and roll. Here we go. Occult gore metal. That's the name. That's not the subgenre. That's the name of the guy or girl. Black and roll for sure. Sure, there are a lot of Motorhead and Venom sounding bands, and it gets overwhelming. But once you find those really good ones, for example, Midnight, Hell Ripper, Speed Wolf. Also can't go wrong with some Coagulating Darkness. You can never go wrong with Coagulating Darkness. Satanic Royalty or Wildfire. It's extreme, yet it's still rock and roll. It deals with themes of sleaze, occultism, violence, and rock and roll itself. Jason Fryatt says black and roll and death and roll has got all the hooks of hard rock with its feet in the blues, mixed with two extreme styles, makes black metal and death metal more interesting for me. So, guys, this is a little bit different than the previous two we've talked about, where, I mean, in very broad terms, an element of this sound is coming from a place that's relatively more accessible, relatively more mainstream, if we can even use that word in this conversation. What are your thoughts on this style?
I'm not really much of a fan of it, admittedly. It just, to me, it's like, it's too fun. It's too good time. You know, but you know, Entombed's Wolverine Blues has always been a benchmark for getting this genre going.
The Pioneer record.
That's a great, it's an awesome album. I don't care what anyone says. Oh, Entombed, no, it is a great album. Also, there's a band from Finland, Zizma. Their stuff from the early '90s, especially their album. It's a good death and roll kind of. Great death and roll album. That's what it gets considered. Black and roll, I'm not. I think the last album that I liked, that had black and roll elements is probably Carpathian Forest's Black Shining Leather. And I like black and roll. Satyricon incorporate it into their music sometimes, which I like.
I'm a fan of Abath, so I guess that's kind of part of this conversation, or Abath. whatever the fuck he, you know.
There you go, yeah.
He'd be sure to tell you. Yeah. You a fan?
Yeah, I mean, again, you know, this is, well, like I said, there's something coming up that we can talk about. Yeah, I mean, you know, like you said, sometimes, you know, I partake in a beer or two, and
Shocking.
Would like something to go along with that, and it's, you know, it's a really good beer-soaked music. It is kind of a bit of an exception to what we've been talking about, where it's definitely potentially easier listening than, say, black metal or death metal on its own. But I think it does define itself as a microgenre with the black and roll and the death and roll, because you have certain bands like Tribulation or Cloak that I've talked about recently, which are black metal with rock, hard rock influences going into the rock. But you wouldn't define those as black and roll because there's something dirty, nasty, you know, the rock and roll, like the you know, pelvis gyrating, sexual, substance abuse.
Just a little bit of Sunset Strip in there.
Yeah, a little bit of that to kind of, you know, give it the edge, give it the thing, and you know,
the fun factor.
Yeah, the fun factor.
Yeah. So what I've always admired about your performances, especially, because what you did is you actually brought humor to the stage in a way that, you know, none of the Norwegian bands and most, you know, extreme metal bands haven't really done. Is humor important to you?
Yeah, of course, it's the devil's music. Jesus Christ, superstar.
I guess my question is, how are you getting away with this? And maintaining your credibility within this scene?
I guess I'm die hard.
I'm not sure I understand.
Balance. Sometimes, you know, I was working with scaffolding for years, and you gotta respect the heights, because if you don't, you fall. Living on the edge.
Djent. Now for something
Here we go.
completely different. Roll up your sleeves. Djent, we've talked about on the show before. Let's get into it.
Is that how you pronounce? I don't even know how you pronounce it.
You do now.
You do now. I do. Yes.
Because if it's djent, you're hearing
Djent.
about it on the internet. Corey Che McGilligan is back. Says Djent is another one that doesn't quite make it into genre proper status. Kind of sits on the fence between metalcore and deathcore. Max Morin, Djent is the metal sound of the 2010s, so many bands have been influenced by it recently. I think it helped bring in hordes of new metal fans this decade. Nick Lang says, Djent for me, it's loads of people lump the bands together, but there's a lot of variety and insane technical ability, as well as some of the best vocalists in the business. Tesseract, Periphery, After the Burial, Born of Osiris, Ginger, Ghost Iris, Monuments. If you can't find a single band you like in there, I'd really be surprised. So yeah, probably the most polarizing microgenre so far that we've talked about. I'm going to assume that Chris Bruni is not a fan of Djent.
No comment.
Am I a crazy man?
No, you're pretty much
Okay,
on
Blayne
the ball.
Smith.
Yeah, so.
Yeah, also not a fan, but this
Fair.
is what's great about the microgenre is that, you know, it's something that originated out of just a term for a technique, just, you know, palm muting, excessive palm muting. Just it was just sounded like djent. Someone was like, that's what it sounds like. That's what it sounds like when you make that noise. And then a bunch of people started using it, and it is really polarizing, and that's why it's useful to have, even though a lot of djent bands don't like having that slapped on because it can be a bit of an insult from the metal crowd. But you know, there is a massive variety in that genre, but it's no matter what end of the spectrum you're coming in on, it's going to turn some people off, which is why I think the label is so useful, right? You have bands that are you know, harsher and more guttural. You have bands that are almost exclusively singing, you know? But it still has that sound where when someone hears it, they go, man, this is awesome. This is just what I've been looking for. Or someone else hears it and goes like, oh, no, turn it off.
You can be candid. Why are you not a fan, Chris?
I'm honestly just not into it.
Yeah.
I mean, I like some of the early Meshuggah albums. I always assumed that genre are just bands trying to rip off Meshuggah or trying to sound like them.
Right. Yeah.
But other than that, it's just not my thing.
I want to go on record that in the 80s, long before the internet, when me and my pals used to sit around and listen to metal, the sound that the word we came up with
Yes.
to how to vocalize the sound of a guitar note was jun. Okay? So it's DJUN. This is a real thing. We actually wrote that word out at one time. So fuck you, gent. We had jun first, but
Well, isn't that the natural progression? Jun is it played open, gent is it palm
I don't know,
muted.
maybe it's just production values. Jun became gent because it just got a little more brighter. I'm getting into the weeds now because you know I love to talk about production and sound. But anyway, that was a really boring rabbit hole. Let's move on to the next microgenre, avant-garde black metal. Eric Knox, bear with me. Oransi Pazazu?
Yep. Oranti Pazuzu?
Thank
I
you.
don't know.
Sparty Dowdy?
Yeah.
Is that right?
Yeah, I think so. Again, it's got weird squiggles in it. Who the hell knows?
It's your script, dude. It's on my Malo Carpatan. I don't even know these bands.
They're cool. That's a cool band. They're like Master's Hammer.
Okay. Yeah, I'm definitely reading
into
another
that.
language. I like how they use anachronistic sounds at times, effects, vintage keyboards, cowbells, odd percussion. They create walls of sound and song structures and arrangements that are unorthodox but powerful and artistic. Lord Infausto. My favorite would have to be the avant-garde and experimental stuff. There is a wide variety of bands completely different from each other that fall into those labels. Bands like Ishan, Igor, Diablo Swing Orchestra, Boris, Brain Tentacles, Shining, and Trinacria. It's a shame that usually bands play this, that play this style of music end up being a project with just a couple of albums. Not many get enough support to continue creating. How they mix entirely different elements in such perfection without stopping from being brutal or heavy provide an infinite landscape of texture. So avant-garde black metal?
Yeah, I'm definitely a fan of it. One of the first bands to produce avant-garde black metal would be Vedbwen's End from Norway.
Yeah.
Their Written in Waters album was kind of like, to me, I think that's like the springboard where avant-garde black metal started. This is a black metal band who was kind of influenced by stuff like Celtic Frost, Into the Pandemonium meets Voivod. That's the kind of vibe I got from it.
Right.
And then, there are a lot of bands that maybe are not considered avant-garde black metal today, but they incorporate stuff, avant-garde black metal stuff into their music. Artists like Leviathan, Death Spell Omega.
Right.
I think there's a lot of avant-garde black metal traits in those bands' music.
Your opinion on this microgenre?
I enjoy a lot of avant-garde black metal, but I don't know if I consider it a microgenre, really, because two things. A, I think, like I said earlier, if you say avant-garde black metal, you can kind of get an idea of what it is. I feel like it is it's more of a subgenre than like a microgenre, because it doesn't, or maybe it's not even a genre yet, because it is still, I think it is still really forming and kind of coalescing. You know, like
It's more like a style, maybe.
yeah, like a style, like the Wormlust out of Iceland I talked about in the Icelandic black metal episode is a really cool project, and Mystic Chaos, the Wormlust label, has some cool stuff being released that's kind of in that direction. But I think if you said avant-garde black metal, while it wouldn't communicate all the bands, someone could go, does it sound like if a black metal musician took acid? And in the case of Wormlust, you'd be like, yeah, it sounds like they recorded the album on acid. And you can kind of communicate it. And I think it could be an emerging one, though. It could be something we're watching, because it hasn't been that long since we had our kind of second wave of black metal, which is more like the first wave of black metal.
Right.
So it's these years that people have been starting to kind of really find other things to do with that music that's really cool. I think it's interesting because I do think sometimes, as a big black metal fan, I say this, black metal can get stale pretty quick.
Right.
If you're playing conventional black metal, there is, it's a
Only
narrow,
so many places you could go. Yeah.
So just being like, okay, well, there's only so many places I can go if I stay remotely anywhere near the lanes, so let's just go off-roading and start hitting the dirt, I think is a very good thing for black metal, and I think it really can keep the genre going strong and inject just black metal itself with life.
So I guess we've covered 5 or so microgenres of metal that people are talking about that seem to have some significance or meaning today, but there are, guess what? There's more. Surprise, surprise. And I want to go through a few more. We can talk them through, and then we want to wrap things up by, deciding on what those main microgenres of metal are today. Matt Jones says normal deathcore like Suicide Silence never interested me, but these new deathcore bands that take influence from other genres are amazing. Blackened deathcore like Lorna Shore is brutal but still extremely atmospheric and often melodic, giving it an interesting contrast. Also, technical deathcore like Rings of Saturn is just super interesting and fun to listen to while often being proggy in its writing. Progressive deathcore like Fit for an Autopsy and the new Whitechapel is probably my favorite. The use of clean vocals, extra atmosphere, clean guitars, and melody added a lot to their sound. Derbier Kaiser says blackened folk. Folk metal built on power metal that can sound too bouncy and samey to me, but adding black metal's atmospheric and extremity produces some really amazing and savage music. The North American folk tradition is particularly intriguing. Bands like Panopticon, Wayfarer, Zeal, and Ardor, and Untamed Lands. We've got mention of neofolk and dark ambient, death grind. Chris, any comments on any of these? Any of these that you think kind of are meaningful? We should be talking
Definitely,
about?
the black and folk thing. The dude there mentioned Panopticon and Wayfarer. I work with Wayfarer as well too.
Right.
That seems to be picking up a lot of buzz in the U.S. with those kind of bands.
Right.
And some bands related to those bands, but they're not necessarily black and folk.
Yeah.
But I think black and folk metal has always been popular.
Yeah.
Regardless.
Yeah.
So that has its own history.
Right.
Where you can just trace back, as far back, as when black metal in the 90s erupted from Norway.
Right.
Starting off with bands like Ulver.
Yeah.
When they started out, they had the black folk element to their music. So it just goes from there.
Cool. Yeah. So any of these subgenres, microgenres, if you will, you wanna comment on?
Well, I think the interesting thing about the black and folk bands listed there is that potentially is a microgenre that maybe no one's come up with like a really good name for yet. Is when you think black and folk or black metal with folk elements, you think European folk music. You think, some guy with a lute out there, kind of being mixed in there.
That was good.
But with, Panopticon and Wayfarer, what we're talking about is, and Zeal and Ardor to a lesser extent, is the American folk music coming in, and blackened American folk doesn't sound quite right. There's something a little. So I think that could potentially be an emerging microgenre that needs a name. And then just one to mention that is also kind of on the cusp. There's maybe 10 to 15 bands depending on who you ask, but Portal is a band that a lot of people have been asking what the hell is Portal, because calling it death metal does not work for a lot of people, because they're a band that's gaining a lot of popularity, and so you go, hey, have you heard this new death metal band Portal, or this death metal band's last album? And you go, okay, let's hear it, and you go, this is not what I thought was going to happen.
There's not one identifiable riff in their music, which is awesome.
Yeah,
it's just noise.
So there's cavernous death, cave death, cavern death has been being bandied around a bit as a term for that. I don't know. I'm actually curious.
I like cave death.
To know how you feel about the cave.
I'm not. I can tell you the bands that get lumped into that cavern core death metal, they absolutely despise that.
Oh, shit.
They despise that term.
Is that right?
Yeah, they do.
How come?
I don't know. It's just because, the bands I'm referring to, there's a sophistication to their aesthetic, to their playing, to their lyrics. It's not some primitive.
That's why I like the addition of cavernous, not saying cave, because cave does sound kind of derogatory, but cavernous sounds like it's this, you know, it's this big dark chasm, and I think it helps communicate some of the emotion of this genre.
Yeah.
Where it doesn't sound like it's being tossed about as like, oh, your music's simple. It's like your music is some like essence of primordial evil, the primordial annihilator coming out of a cave. You guys have conducted a ritual deep under earth, away from human prying eyes.
One thing's for sure, Lockhorns is the only place where we can debate the nuances between something being a cave or cavernous or cavern-like.
Right.
I love it. That's why we're here. But okay, so let's step back for a moment. We've had a lot of conversation around different microgenres, what they are, the good and the bad of microgenres, why they're part of metal, and of course, what are those microgenres that people are talking about and are most relevant. But I think we got to start putting our flag in the ground, so to speak. And I turn to you guys. You know, what is it? You know, what are those microgenres? And maybe this is a bit of like staring into the crystal ball, because, you know, what are the microgenres that you guys feel are the ones that have momentum, that are you know, going to have staying power? Because I think that's important here, because things do come and go, you know, especially when we're talking about a genre of music, as you said at the outset, Chris, where, you know, there's so many bands coming from different parts of the world and drawing on different instruments. So Blayne, maybe I'll start with you. I mean, we started with 5. Is it those 5 and it's the conversation's over, or?
Like I said, for me, I don't know about avant-garde black metal, because I feel like that still hasn't kind of figured out what it is yet.
Yep.
I think Funeral Doom is kind of the poster child for microgenres, and the kind of some of the advantages of microgenres, where, you know, a band like Bellwitch is currently, you know, doing very well. There's a lot of appeal, and there's even, which is rare for, there's outsider appeal. So it's like, are we on the verge of, you know, Funeral Doom getting the tap on the shoulder to come up to the subgenre leagues?
Yep.
So I think that's kind of a really great one to put up there as like, this is kind of the, you know, the ideal standard for what we get in a microgenre, where it's different, it's unique, it's not, we're not quibbling over the, you know, some slight change to the music. It's pretty drastic, but it doesn't isolate you as a band. It doesn't prevent, you know, a crossover, more mainstream success.
And you talking makes me think maybe sort of a criteria here of microgenres is in fact that they are smaller.
Yeah.
And they're micro. And that's not in any pejorative sense or any judgmental sense. It's just, again, these are styles of metal that people are drawn to because they combine a very specific combination of sounds and production values, and it just, whatever, hits the center of the dartboard for some people. So, Funeral Doom, what else?
Yeah, that's a good.
What gets put in the pantheon of microgenres, in your opinion? Does war metal belong?
I mean, war metal, I just see war metal as a subgenre of just black metal in general. I guess with the popularity, picking up where Funeral Doom left off, I mean, doom metal is just really, it's at its renaissance right now.
Right.
So, you know, any genre within, or subgenre within doom metal, I mean, think about it. I think if I can think of any genre in metal that has the most subgenres, or microgenres or whatever, it's probably doom metal, because there's so many different styles of it.
Right.
There's death doom, there's funeral doom, there's stoner doom, there's traditional doom metal, there's psychedelic doom, you know, even bands who play psych rock or any of that, they get lumped into the doom metal.
You guys all know I'm a card-carrying guy that likes his metal fast, generally. This is, when you play music that slow, it's just so much more time.
You're a business owner, a father, you got places to be.
Just, you know, so much room to sprinkle, put a lute in there. Why not? I mean, hey, it's doom. It's like, it's a big, giant pot. Well, Blayne, what else?
I mean, I do think war metal is a great micro-genre. You know, it is very isolating being a war metal band, but you know, particularly this year, we've had two off the top of my head, Titan Blood, and Cult of Extinction both released albums this year that I think are like phenomenal, really great examples of war metal, but also kind of like it's a micro-genre because there's still like a bit of difference in that. You know, you're gonna like both of them if you like war metal, but it's not like, okay, well, yeah, I get it, you like blasphemy. You know, there is a little bit of wiggle room, some guys in black hoods trying things and experimenting. Who knows who they are, but they're out there, and I salute you.
God bless them. So maybe less objectively, more subjectively, Chris,
Right.
for you, what are other microgenres of metal that you think are exciting moving forward? Places within metal, areas within metal that show a lot of promise, and
I
you think
think
there's room
definitely.
to grow?
I think post black metal, you know, black metal bands that incorporate elements of shoegaze, you know, and atmospheric indie rock.
Okay.
You know,
Yeah.
incorporate element. You know, like bands like Godspeed You Black Emperor.
Right.
You see black metal bands incorporating. Being influenced by bands like that,
Right.
and even being influenced by non-metal bands.
Yeah.
I think that's a great thing. I mean, you know, I'm kind of getting into that again right now, and there's, you know,
Yeah.
I may not be into all of it. There was a period where I was just not into it, just because I was just kind of sick of it. But you know, there's a lot of bands, black metal bands, that are kind of incorporating this style, even though they probably hate to be labeled as post-black metal or whatever. I think that's a very promising genre right now, coming up, especially when you have bands like, you know, Death Heaven definitely blowing up,
Sure.
stuff like that. So that's I think we're gonna see further growth within
Sure.
that subgenre.
Sure, I'm sure post-metal, post-black metal, whatever we want to call it,
Yeah.
it has its own microgenres within
Yeah.
that I'm not even aware of, and I'm not even going to go there.
Yeah.
So Blayne, maybe we'll give you the last word. I mean, what I find interesting about this conversation is because we're delving into this sort of microscopic world of metal, it becomes naturally quite subjective, right?
Yep.
There's just less consensus than we can say, thrash metal, you know, whatever. Testament is a thrash metal band,
Yeah.
and no one's ever going to disagree
Yeah.
about
Yeah.
that, and it will be in the history books forever. But in terms of like any remaining microgenres that you see, either as a fan or more as an expert, where things are going, what's exciting?
Like I said, I mean, we talked about I think definitely the most exciting thing for me right now is we'll say yet unnamed direction the Portal's going in, since they all hate it. Tell one of them to come up with something and email it to me, and I'll get it going on the channel. I think that's, you know, it's almost like it's post-death metal, but in the exact opposite post direction that the other one's going, where it's like it's still a deconstruction, it's still a late period where we've had death metal for so long and we've experimented with it for so long, and we've taken it, we've stretched it in all the directions we can kind of stretch it. So let's just start cutting into it and tearing it up. So for me, I think that's definitely the kind of one I'm most excited to see what happens in the next couple of years. I will say from that list, I fully back djent being a subgenre, so that I know to stay the hell away from it, or a microgenre. I'm happy it being there. I think it deserves its place in the world, and if you enjoy it, you're listening to metal, and I'm all for it. I just don't want to be anywhere near it, so please call it that so I know.
Or call it Jun, and that'll make me a lot happier.
Yes.
Okay, well, I guess we've got 4 of 5. We've talked about djent, we've talked about war metal, we've talked about funeral doom, and we've talked about post-black metal. I don't think there's a lot of fans out there that would disagree with that. I guess maybe as the old guy in the room, and maybe a little bit more traditional in my leanings, it would seem to be a huge omission if we didn't include black and roll / death and roll in this. You know, we may not all be fans of that particular style of metal. You know, the hallmark being, you know, you never stop with the 4 on the floor, right? you know, because there are a lot of bands out there, it is a sound, and it's a sound where there's a regional, you know, we talked, you know, Abat, we talked about Tribulation and Midnight, and there's a lot of variations on that. So maybe there's our 5, but I think what the conversation has revealed to me is just like when we get into microgenres, this is really about the future of metal, and maybe we'll be here next year and all of these will become officially declared subgenres of metal. You know, and I think the more important thing here is it's an indication of, you know, how healthy the metal underground is, right? And how much the music has changed and the industry around it and the technology around it has changed
I think it's
over the last 10, 15 years.
I mean, I think we're in a, you know, we are in a renaissance period right now in metal. I mean, I could say like, oh yeah, I just like the old school stuff from the early 90s and the 80s or whatever. I mean, all my favorite stuff comes from that era, but I think we are truly in a renaissance era of metal right now. I think it's at its peak. So.
Final thoughts, Blayne Smith?
Yeah, I mean, it's a moving target, right? It's interesting because it is what, you know, today's microgenre is tomorrow's. I mean, if, you know, when you were a kid and you got those first couple records, if I told you death metal is going to be the kind of quintessential metal, you would be like, I don't think that's possible. I love it, but I don't think that's possible. You know, in 2000, if I said, hey, all you guys, they're gonna make a Hollywood movie about what's going on in your little Norwegian towns in 15 years, they would go, I don't think so, man. This music's pretty out there. But, you know, nowadays, black metal is like, you know, you're gonna see someone coming out of Urban Outfitters in a Dark Throne shirt. You know, so.
I don't think that's the best note to end on, but it's a note to end on. But anyway, Chris Bruni, great to see you.
Thank you, Sam.
Thanks for joining us,
Thanks for having me.
Thanks as always. Blayne, thanks everyone for joining us. Subscribe, follow us on Facebook, Instagram, all that stuff. This was fun. Happy to be talking about metal, and thanks for spending time with us on Lock Horns. See you next time.